A teacher called a black boy a liar about his dad's job. He went completely silent when a four-star general walked into the classroom. A teacher called a black boy a liar about his dad's job, thinking the accusation would go unchecked. He didn't realize a four-star general was about to walk in and turn the classroom upside down. The moment the boy spoke, silence fell over everyone. Subscribe if you believe arrogance collapses instantly when true authority steps in. My dad is a four-star general. The words dropped into the classroom like a stone into still water, sharp, clean, and immediately disruptive. Heads turned. Pens paused mid-scratch. Even the hum of the overhead lights seemed to hush for a split second. Jaron Tolliver stood beside his desk in the third row, holding his project sheet in both hands. His voice had been steady, but his fingers gripped the laminated paper tightly, as if it were the only thing keeping him from being pulled under. From the front of the classroom, Mr. Benson looked up with a bemused expression, tapping the edge of his clipboard with a capped pen. He was a lean man in his early 50s with a gray-streaked beard and the air of someone who had heard one too many exaggerations in his years of teaching middle school. His eyes scanned Jaron over the rims of his glasses. A four-star general? He repeated slowly, like the words were foreign currency he had to inspect before accepting. Yes, sir, Jaron said again, quieter this time. He's stationed at Greystone Command Base. The temperature in the room seemed to shift. A few students giggled, unsure if it was safe to laugh yet. Others just glanced around, tried to read the social cues. The boy in the next seat leaned back, eyebrows raised. In the back row, a snort of disbelief escaped someone's throat. Even those who wanted to believe him stayed silent, unsure of whether standing by him would make them the next target of ridicule. Mr. Benson let out a short, dry chuckle and shook his head. Now, Jaron, we've talked about honesty in this class, haven't we? He set the clipboard down with an exaggerated slowness. If your father was a general, don't you think we'd know about it by now? Jaron opened his mouth to reply, but nothing came out right away. A flush began to creep up his neck, not just from embarrassment, but from something deeper, something older. The look in Mr. Benson's eyes wasn't just disbelief. It was dismissal, like he had already categorized Jaron and closed the drawer. It's true, Jaron said after a beat, his voice gaining weight. He's been deployed a lot. That's why he couldn't come to the last ones, but today, Mr. Benson raised his hand, palm out like a referee. Jaron, he interrupted, his tone firm but dripping with condescension. It's not polite to lie for attention, son. I understand we all want to feel special. I'm not lying, Jaron said too fast. But let's not make things up just to sound impressive. The teacher's voice cut through like a paper slice, thin, clean, and surprisingly painful. The classroom went deathly quiet. The earlier laughter had vanished, replaced with the uncomfortable weight of shared awkwardness. Jaron could feel the eyes on him, not with curiosity anymore, but with pity or worse, mockery. Even the whiteboard behind Mr. Benson, still filled with the morning's notes on ancient Mesopotamia, looked distant and irrelevant now. The moment had taken over the room. Jaron looked down at the floor, then back at Mr. Benson. There was something different in his eyes now. Not fear, not even frustration, just a cold certainty that this would be one of those moments he would remember long after the desks and backpacks and spelling quizzes were gone. He'll be here at 2:30 today, Jaron said quietly, for parent visitation. Mr. Benson tilted his head with theatrical skepticism, his lips twitching in a smirk. He placed his hands on his hips and turned slightly toward the rest of the class, as if inviting them into the joke. Well, he said, chuckling to himself, I look forward to meeting your imaginary general then. The bell had barely finished ringing when the scrape of chairs and shuffling of shoes filled the room like a wave breaking over Jaron Tolliver. Students filtered out in clumps, laughter simmering beneath hushed tones. A few glanced back at him, not with curiosity, but with that uneasy mix of avoidance and suspicion that turns classmates into spectators. Mr. Benson didn't say a word. He remained seated at his desk, eyes locked on his lesson planner with the mechanical stiffness of someone pretending a conversation hadn't just cut too deep. The silence between them wasn't neutral. It was loaded, Jaron rose from his chair, slowly, carefully, like any sudden movement might make the weight in his chest shift even heavier. He picked up his backpack in silence, gripping the strap tight enough that the stitching stretched. His eyes met the wall clock above the whiteboard, 2:05. The clock hands ticked forward, indifferent. He stepped into the hallway, the door clicking shut behind him, and the noise of the school came rushing back. Lockers slamming, sneakers skidding on wax tiles, the smell of tater tots still hanging faint in the air. But none of it reached him. He walked like a shadow, drifting through bright corridors. Near the science wing, two boys leaned against the drinking fountain, whispering like actors playing to a small crowd. One cupped his hands to his mouth like a fake radio. "Eagle Base, do you copy?" "General Tolliver requesting air support in room 12A," he said in a mock-serious tone. The other boy chuckled. "Yeah, right. Next thing you know, he'll say his dad's an astronaut too. Maybe even fights aliens on weekends." Jaron didn't stop walking, but his jaw tightened and his ears burned. He turned the corner without acknowledging them, his shoulders stiff, his steps just slightly faster than normal. That laugh wasn't just about him. It was a signal to others. Permission to doubt. Permission to mock. In the cafeteria, it was worse. He'd barely set down his tray when a voice from the next table rang out in a theatrical tone. "General Tolliver, we've got a crisis on table 6. Mashed potato spillage. Send reinforcements immediately." The boy held up a banana like a walkie-talkie, smirking as he saluted in mockery. Another one chimed in, "Sir, yes, sir. Deploying napkins and apple juice missiles." Laughter scattered across the room like thrown dice. Some of it was quiet. Some wasn't. None of it was kind. Jaron stared at his tray, pizza square, a scoop of corn, one limp chocolate chip cookie. His fork barely touched the food. He sat alone at the far end of the table, away from the clusters of students grouped by friend circles and after-school cliques. There was an empty seat across from him and another beside him. No one even pretended to ask if they could join. He pressed his thumb against the edge of the plastic tray, fighting the urge to snap it. The voices blurred in the background, but one phrase repeated itself in his mind like a stuck record. "If your father was a general," Mr. Benson had said, "don't you think we'd know about it?" He hadn't even shouted it. That was the worst part, the calmness of it, as if he'd made a formal declaration that Jaron's truth didn't matter, because it didn't fit in the box Mr. Benson already believed in. Jaron looked up at the clock in the cafeteria. 2:15, 15 minutes. 15 minutes until his father might walk through those front doors. If he came, that's what twisted deepest inside him. Not the mocking, not even the teacher's disbelief. It was the possibility that his father wouldn't show. Again, he thought of the past visitation Fridays. The first time, he told everyone his dad was coming. He had even saved a seat. The second time, he kept quiet, said his dad was probably busy. The third time, he hadn't even asked. But this time was supposed to be different. General Langston Tolliver had stood in the kitchen last week, straightened the edge of his tie, and looked him in the eye. "I'll be there, son." This time, no excuses. Jaron had wanted to believe him. Needed to, because this wasn't about just one class project. This was about all the quiet looks, the subtle doubts, the way Mr. Benson's eyes had flicked toward him every time someone exaggerated in class, as if lying came easy to him. As if stories were all he knew. The tray still sat untouched. Jaron forced himself to pick up the cookie and took a bite. It tasted like cardboard. He chewed mechanically, more out of spite than hunger. At the far end of the cafeteria, two boys nudged each other, then looked at him. One of them smirked. "What time's the chopper landing, General Jr.?" Jaron exhaled through his nose, clenched his jaw, and stood up. He left the tray where it was, walked out without a word. The hallway outside was quieter now. Most students had already settled into the afternoon schedule. A few stragglers whispered as he passed. His footsteps felt louder than they were, each one like a countdown. He passed the trophy case, paused. His reflection stared back at him through the smudged glass, shoulders slightly slumped, eyes tired but still lit by something unbroken. Behind the glass, a plaque for academic excellence caught the light. It reminded him of something his dad had once said after a tough parent-teacher night. Truth doesn't need defense. It just needs endurance. Jaren let the words settle in his chest like armor. Whatever came next, mockery, silence, or vindication, he wouldn't be the one backing down. He checked the time on his phone. 2:25 p.m. 5 minutes. He turned toward room 12, his feet no longer dragging but not rushing either. There was power in not running, in showing up with quiet resolve. By the time he reached the classroom door, the hall was empty again. The final flickers of laughter from the cafeteria were too far to follow him now. He placed his hand on the doorknob, exhaled, entered. Inside, the room was already filling with visiting parents. Mr. Benson stood at the front, smiling thinly as he shook hands and made polite introductions. He glanced at Jaren for half a second, then looked away. Jaren found his seat, didn't speak, just waited. The clock on the wall ticked forward. 2:26, 2:27. The anticipation curled inside him, slow and sickening. He watched the door. 2:28, nothing. 2:29, still nothing. Mr. Benson looked at him again. There was something smug beneath his brows, like he was already preparing the lesson plan titled Disappointment. Then, at 2:30 exactly, the hallway outside fell silent. It wasn't the silence of absence. It was the silence of something approaching. Heavy, deliberate footsteps echoed off the polished tile. Slow, measured, confident. The murmur at the front desk had stopped entirely. Mr. Benson turned toward the door. Jaren didn't move, didn't blink. The handle turned, and all he could think was that the seed of doubt Mr. Benson had planted was about to be burned down to the root. This time, I'll let them see for themselves. The footsteps came first, slow, deliberate, heavy enough to silence the hallway. Inside room 12, Jaren Tolliver flinched. His eyes snapped from the clock to the door. 2:29 p.m. His sneaker tapped an uneven rhythm against the linoleum floor, quick and anxious. Around him, the classroom hummed with low conversation and shifting chairs as parents trickled in for Visitation Friday. Some students were already glowing under their parents' attention. A father clapping his son on the back, a man in scrubs kneeling beside his daughter's desk. Laughter floated easily, but none of it reached Jaren's desk. He sat perfectly upright, fists pressed into his knees. Mr. Benson stood at the front, a practiced smile on his face as he greeted each adult with a handshake and comment about their child's progress. But every so often his eyes flicked toward Jaren, smug, almost pitying. When the boy dared to look up, their eyes locked for a fraction of a second. No acknowledgement, just a thin smirk. Not all stories turn out the way kids imagine them. Mr. Benson murmured under his breath as he turned to greet another parent, his tone low enough to be deniable, but sharp enough to slice. Jaren clenched his jaw, his stomach tightened like a fist. He wanted to believe his father would come. He needed to believe it. But as the minute hand inched past the half-hour mark, doubt twisted in his chest like a worm. What if he got called away again? What if an emergency came up? This had happened before. Briefings, classified meetings, canceled flights. "I'll be there, son," his father had promised. No excuses this time. But promises didn't always survive reality. He stared at the door. Then it happened. The front office murmur abruptly ceased. Not faded, ceased, like a record needle lifted from vinyl. Even the chairs outside the classroom squeaked to a halt. Something was moving through the hallway. Something silent, heavy, commanding. Then the door handle turned. The room stilled as if held in place by invisible thread. Conversations paused mid-sentence. Pen stopped scribbling. A single bead of sweat slid down Jaren's spine. The door opened. A man stepped inside. Not just a man, a presence. A tall, broad-shouldered black man with skin like carved bronze and posture carved from military stone. His deep gray uniform looked sculpted onto him, its lines exact, its fabric pristine. 4 silver stars sat at perfect attention on his epaulets, catching the overhead light with a quiet gleam. Rows of commendations lined his chest. A crimson and gold command badge shimmered near his heart. General Langston Tolliver had entered the room. The effect was immediate. Silence deepened. The fluorescent lights hummed quieter. Even the father who had been laughing moments before slowly sat back in his chair, uncertain of the protocol. Mr. Benson's hand paused midair over a textbook. Every student turned to stare, but the general didn't look at them. Not yet. His eyes moved like scanning radar, sweeping across the room with silent precision. He was assessing, measuring, cataloging, without speaking a word. Then his gaze landed on one person. "Afternoon, Jaren," he said. His voice was low, measured, and steady as a hammer. The tension shattered like glass. Jaren stood so quickly his chair toppled backward with a crash, but he didn't even glance at it. His mouth opened, stunned. "Yes, sir," he said, breath catching. General Tolliver took one step forward, the metal on his uniform gently clinking with authority. "Permission to join your class?" he asked. Gasps rippled through the room. A student near the window dropped his pencil. One father adjusted his tie, like the temperature had changed. A mother placed a hand on her son's shoulder, almost instinctively, as if to say, "Watch this." Yara swallowed. His chest lifted with something fierce and strange, too sharp for pride, too warm for anger. This wasn't a fantasy. This wasn't a story. This was his father, and he had arrived exactly when he said he would. "Permission to join your class?" the general repeated, his calm gaze locked only on his son. Jaren nodded, face flushed but steady. "Yes, sir." The room froze. Mr. Benson's chalk paused midward on the board as the door creaked open, revealing a towering figure silhouetted in the doorway. The man's polished black shoes gleamed against the classroom's linoleum floor. A uniform of deep gray hugged his broad frame, with sharp creases and clean lines that radiated authority. For silver stars rested on each shoulder like quiet thunderclouds, waiting to strike. His eyes scanned the room, not searching, but confirming. Langston Tolliver, 4-star General, Department of Strategic Forces. "I'm here for the 2:30 visitation." His voice wasn't loud, but it didn't need to be. It cut through the stunned air like a drawn blade, precise and final. Mr. Benson turned slowly, almost mechanically. His eyes darted to the collar, the ribbons, the epaulets, and then to the name tag, Tolliver. His Adam's apple bobbed once, then again. He extended his hand, stiff and unsteady. Yes, welcome, General Tolliver," he managed, though the words came out like gravel. The general took 3 steps forward before accepting the handshake. His grip was firm, controlled, but he didn't hold it long. Around the room, parents straightened in their chairs. A few offered respectful nods, unsure whether to speak or simply bear witness. Students gawked silently, caught between awe and confusion. The only one who didn't seem surprised was Jaren, though even he looked as if his breath had been knocked out of him. He stood slowly, reverently, as if rising during a ceremony. "I hear there's been some confusion about my son's presentation," General Tolliver said, his tone as calm as it was cutting. Mr. Benson let out a short laugh, tight, nervous, forced. "Just a small misunderstanding. Kids like to exaggerate sometimes." The general didn't blink. "Jaren doesn't exaggerate," he said, voice flat and resolute. "I taught him that integrity means more than convenience." The silence in the room shifted. What had once been awkward tension now turned into quiet reckoning. Mr. Benson looked away, his shoulders subtly folding inward. His authority in the room had just been erased, not with volume, but with presence. Jaren felt something shift in his chest. Not quite pride, but steadier, like armor being reforged. His father hadn't come to rescue him. He'd come to confirm him. The general turned to the students next, scanning the rows with the composure of a man used to briefing high command rooms. "May I have 2 minutes of your time?" No one dared speak. No one moved. He stepped toward the center of the room, clasped his hands behind his back, and spoke not like a parent, but like a leader. "Your parents may work jobs that don't sound impressive to others," he began, his eyes level and voice even. "But what matters isn't the title. It's the truth behind it." Some of the students nodded faintly, unsure why their throats felt tight. I've seen young men in foxholes lie just to sound braver than they felt. And I've seen quiet boys in classrooms tell the truth, only to be doubted because the truth didn't fit the story someone else had already written. Mr. Benson flinched slightly, but said nothing. Don't let anyone tell you that honesty is unbelievable just because it doesn't match their expectations, General Tolliver continued, pausing long enough to let the silence frame his next words. Then, with a slow, deliberate gesture, he turned toward Jaron and placed a firm, steady hand on his shoulder. Especially when the truth walks into the room wearing 4 stars. The silence cracked like thin ice underfoot. It started with a single clap, sharp, hesitant, uncertain. Then another joined, and another. Within seconds, a quiet cascade of applause rolled through the classroom, as if the very air had been waiting for permission to breathe. Some students clapped politely, unsure of what they were witnessing. Others clapped with awe. A few parents, seated toward the back, exchanged glances and added their hands to the growing ripple of sound. Mr. Benson remained motionless at the front of the class, arms stiff by his sides. His eyes stayed locked on the general's back, the rigid line of his jaw betraying his inner conflict. He didn't smile. He didn't blink. For the first time all year, he looked like the one out of place. General Tolliver, unmoved by the applause, gave a single nod of acknowledgement. No bow, no wave, no grin for approval. Just a firm, quiet motion as if sealing a final word. Then, without a second glance, he turned and calmly took the empty seat beside his son. Jaron turned toward him, his voice a shaky whisper. You really came. The general didn't turn. His eyes remained on the whiteboard, where a faded map of South America hung like an afterthought. Told you I would, he said, his voice low but grounded, like granite beneath still water. At the front of the room, Mr. Benson fumbled with the remote. He clicked forward to the next slide in the presentation, his fingers tight around the plastic. Right, he said awkwardly. Back to topographic features. The Andes Mountains run along the... His voice barely registered. The classroom had shifted. What was once a structured learning space had morphed into something unspoken and electric. Every pair of eyes, student and adult alike, remained half-turned toward the decorated man in the third row, whose very presence disrupted the natural hierarchy of the room. Mr. Benson pushed forward, reciting facts about elevation and river systems. But the lesson fell flat, like music played after eulogy. The words floated, disconnected, as if even the air no longer respected their authority. Then a voice from the back. Sir, a man said, raising his hand, his tone polite but firm. A tall father in a denim shirt with calloused hands and a union ID badge tucked into his coat pocket. Is it true your unit helped resolve the Barren Ridge standoff last year? Every head turned. The general didn't blink. That's classified, he replied calmly. But yes. Gasps rippled through the students. A few leaned forward in their seats. The classroom, already off balance, began to tilt into something unrecognizable. Another hand shot up, this time a boy from the second row. Did you really fly jets? Jaron's eyes lit up, a quiet pride surging behind them. The general's lips curved into the faintest smile. Before they stuck me behind a desk, yes. Even the most restless students were transfixed. Mr. Benson stood helplessly at the front, no longer a conductor, just a witness. The momentum had shifted. The gravity in the room now orbited around someone else. Then, the classroom door opened. The principal, Mr. Daltrey, stepped in, followed by 2 assistant staffers with clipboards. They paused just inside the threshold, taking in the scene like journalists stumbling into a press conference that had started without them. Mr. Daltrey's eyes scanned the room, quickly locating the general. He adjusted his tie and walked over to Mr. Benson, who leaned down as the principal whispered something in his ear. Mr. Benson paled. Whatever was said wasn't heard by the class, but the effect was instant. Mr. Benson stepped back, nodding faintly, his shoulders pulled tight as piano wire. Then the principal turned to face the room. Excuse me, everyone, Mr. Daltrey said with a practiced smile. We'd like to extend an official invitation to our guest. He turned fully toward General Tolliver. Sir, we would be honored if you'd consider joining us for next month's Leadership Assembly. We believe our students and staff could benefit from hearing more about your experience and perspective. A beat passed. The general stood slowly, the sound of the chair scraping against the tile loud in the hush. His eyes found the principal's, steady as iron. He didn't smile. He didn't lecture. He simply said, "Only if you promise to listen this time." He didn't say it loud, but Jaren heard it, and Mr. Benson definitely did. The final bell had rung. Backpacks slammed shut, sneakers squeaked across the linoleum, and the murmur of middle schoolers filled the hallways like a current flooding downstream. But in room 12A, no one moved. Not yet. General Langston Tolliver stood near the chalkboard like an immovable monument, arms crossed loosely, his uniform crisp and his face unreadable. The aftershock of his arrival still lingered in the air, like the cool stillness that follows a sudden summer storm. No one in the room spoke, not the students, not the parents still lingering in the corners, not even Mr. Benson. The teacher shifted awkwardly behind his desk, fumbling with papers he wasn't reading. "We appreciate your visit, General," he finally muttered, the words thin and breathless. "Really, we do." His voice didn't quite carry the weight of sincerity. It trembled slightly, like a door left ajar in a gust of wind. Yada noticed. His father certainly noticed. But the general didn't answer right away. He turned instead to his son. "Want to walk me out?" he asked. The words were simple, but in the silence, they landed like a gavel strike. Jaren didn't hesitate. He grabbed his backpack in one fluid motion, slinging it over his shoulder with a quiet finality. The other students made room, parting instinctively as father and son stepped into the hallway. The overhead lights buzzed faintly above them, and the polished floor reflected their strides like a mirror stretching into the distance. Behind them, Mr. Benson remained frozen near the board, his fingers now gripping the edge of the desk. He hadn't looked the general in the eyes. Not once. As they walked, Jaren heard the whispers begin. "I didn't think he was telling the truth," someone murmured. "No way. That was really his dad," another voice replied. Jaren didn't respond. He kept his chin high, his steps measured. He didn't need to respond anymore. The truth had walked in and introduced itself. And now it echoed behind him with every stare, every hushed voice trying to piece together what had just happened. When they reached the main doors, sunlight spilled across the tile, warm and gold, as if the outside world had been waiting for them. The general paused beneath the overhang of the entrance, squinting slightly at the parking lot. A sleek black military SUV sat parked in the visitor's zone, its surface glinting with late afternoon light. But the general didn't unlock the door yet. He turned to his son, his expression softening just slightly. The rigid lines of command relaxed just enough to allow something personal through. A question that had waited years to be asked. "How often does this kind of thing happen, son?" Jaren looked away, pretending to study the bike rack across the pavement. A gust of wind pushed through the open doorway, tugging at his backpack straps. When he finally answered, his voice was steady but quiet. "More than I tell you." The general's jaw shifted, just barely. He gave no visible sign of surprise, no dramatic reaction. But something settled behind his eyes, a weight, heavy and sudden. He gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. That answer would follow him. As they reached the car, General Tolliver opened the passenger door for his son, letting Jaren climb in first. He closed it gently, walked around the vehicle in silence, and slid into the driver's seat. For a moment, neither spoke. The engine hadn't started yet. The world outside kept moving, students running to buses, parents honking to children, teachers waving across the lot. But inside the SUV, it was still. A different kind of silence now. Not heavy like the classroom's awkward pause. Not stunned like the hallway's disbelief. This silence was reflective. It belonged to two people who understood the cost of restraint. Then, without a word, the general turned the key. Back in room 12, Mr. Benson sat alone. The classroom had emptied, but he hadn't moved. The window blinds clicked softly in the breeze from the air vent. He reached for the edge of his desk and pulled Jaren's laminated project sheet toward him, the one with the neat handwriting and the bold words written at the top. "My father is a 4-star general." He stared at it. A moment later, he opened his laptop. The screen lit his face with pale light. He began typing an email to the principal. Subject: Request for staff review discussion. He stared at it. Deleted it. Typed something else. Deleted that too. His fingers hovered over the keyboard, trembling slightly. Regret isn't always loud. Sometimes it just sits with you unspoken, too proud to be named, but too honest to ignore. He closed the laptop, leaned back in his chair, and in that quiet room, with the overhead lights buzzing faintly and the walls still echoing the truth he had dismissed, Mr. Benson whispered to no one, "I should have just listened." The teacher smirked, confident his status would protect him, unaware that every student, every word, and every military protocol aligned behind the father's commanding presence. If you believe cruelty under assumed power always folds when strategy meets discipline, hit subscribe now, because justice never hesitates. The curtains were already drawn back. The auditorium lights dimmed, leaving only the wide, expectant hush of hundreds of middle school students shifting in their metal chairs. A low murmur drifted through the air, thick with anticipation. The principal stood at the podium, adjusting his tie twice before speaking. His voice cracked slightly over the mic. "Welcome, everyone, to our first ever Voices of Integrity assembly." He began, his tone unnaturally upbeat, like a man trying to smooth ice with warm hands. "We're honored to host a leader who reminds us how truth, discipline, and courage still matter." Then he stepped aside. From the left wing of the stage, General Langston Tolliver walked into view. He moved slowly, not to delay, but with the steadiness of someone who knew the weight of every step. He wore no medals on his chest today, no ribbons meant to impress. Just the uniform, deep gray, sharply pressed, for silver stars glowing under the stage lights. And yet, it wasn't the uniform that silenced the room. It was the gravity that seemed to follow him in, pulling every whisper into silence. Even the students who hadn't seen him before sensed something had changed. The air had shifted. He reached the podium without notes. No slides, no teleprompter. Only his voice, quiet at first. "Most of you know me now," he said, the microphone catching the lower register of his voice. "But I'm not here because of my title." A pause. A stillness. "I'm here because a teacher told my son he was lying, and my son didn't let that break him." In the back row, Mr. Benson sat stiffly, hands clenched in his lap. His eyes remained fixed on a spot just below the stage, refusing to meet the general's gaze. The principal sat beside him, head bowed slightly, as if he too wasn't sure what would come next. General Tolliver let his words settle, then continued. "Doubt," he said, "can be healthy. It challenges us, forces us to think critically. But doubt with disrespect," his voice dropped half a note, sharpening like a blade, "is another name for bias." The audience held still. No coughs, no fideting. Even the restless 8th grade boys in the back row had gone quiet. Somewhere in the front, a 7th grader leaned forward and whispered to a friend, "This feels bigger than school." The friend didn't reply. He didn't need to. General Tolliver's hands rested lightly on the edges of the podium. When a person tells you something that challenges your expectations, the first question should not be, "Is it impressive enough to believe?" but "Why don't I believe them?" What you believe about others says more about your own limits than theirs. Jaron, sitting just off stage to the right with the student council, didn't move. He watched his father, his back straight, face calm, but his hands were locked together in his lap, gripping tightly. He could feel the room changing. Not just the air, but the way people were looking at each other. At him, at Mr. Benson. "You don't have to speak loudly," the general went on. "You don't need to argue. Sometimes truth just waits, quietly, patiently, and then it walks in through the front door." He took a step back. That was it. No flirtish, no raised voice. Just that final sentence dropped like a stone into still water. The silence that followed was more powerful than any applause. But when the clapping began, tentative at first, it grew rapidly. Row after row of students, then teachers, then staff on the sides, rising to their feet. Even a janitor by the side entrance wiped his hand on his uniform and clapped twice before stopping, not wanting to draw attention. In the back row, Mr. Benson remained seated, but the movement around him was unmistakable. His jaw tensed. Jaron didn't smile. He didn't cheer. But something in his chest eased, like a weight he hadn't realized he was carrying had finally been acknowledged by the world. As the assembly began to wind down, and students buzzed with the things they couldn't stop whispering about, some already pulling out phones to type it into group chats, Jaren remained still, staring not at his father, but at the ripple his words had caused. One by one, students stood in line near the steps to the stage, not just to meet a general, but to shake hands with a man who'd done something far rarer, stood up without anger, without boasting, and made truth feel like something that didn't need to prove itself. Backstage, the principal turned to an assistant. "I think we need to do this again." But General Tolliver, now stepping away from the podium, had said all he needed. "Truth doesn't always shout," he had said. "Sometimes it just waits patiently, then walks in through the front door." The line had thinned. The clamor of applause still echoed faintly in the auditorium rafters, but most students had either found their way back to their homerooms or lingered by the doors, whispering in clusters. On stage, General Langston Tolliver stood firm but approachable, shaking each hand offered to him with the same quiet dignity he carried into battlefields and boardrooms alike. He didn't just nod, he looked each young man in the eye. "Stay honest," he told one. "Be clear in who you are," he told another. Jaren Tolliver stood a few feet away, near the edge of the stage, his arms at his sides, watching his father navigate the crowd, not like a celebrity, but like a compass. Every word his father spoke redirected the attention away from medals and stars and back toward the simple principle that had anchored this moment: integrity. From the back row, a figure moved forward, stiff-legged, hands fidgeting with a folder he wasn't actually using. "Mr." Benson's approach was deliberate, like someone crossing a frozen lake unsure if it would hold. His usual sharpness was gone. The confident lean, the clipped tone, the smug smiles, they'd vanished. In their place was a man walking toward consequence. "General Tolliver," he said as he reached the front, voice firm but noticeably strained. The general didn't blink. He turned slowly, scanning Benson with a calm that was almost surgical. "Yes. May I speak with you privately?" Benson asked, his fingers tightening on the edge of his folder as if gripping a life preserver. The general nodded once. "Of course." They stepped aside, near the back curtain where the edge of the spotlight dimmed into shadow. Jaren watched from a distance, his heart thudding, not with fear, but with expectation. For days, he'd rehearsed what he might say if Benson ever apologized. But now it was out his hands, and that somehow felt better. "I owe your son an apology, Mr." Benson began, eyes lowered, voice low. "I let my assumptions cloud my judgment. I thought I was protecting the integrity of the classroom. I thought—" He stopped himself, realizing how little weight his justifications carried. General Tolliver studied him in silence. The backdrop flickered with the hum of stage lights, faint buzz meeting the slow hush of post-event cleanup. "Integrity," the general said at last, "isn't threatened by the truth, only by the refusal to recognize it." The word struck with more force than a reprimand. Mr. Benson visibly flinched, then nodded slowly. "I'd like to make things right with Jaren, if he'll let me." The general didn't offer sympathy. He didn't soften. His expression remained unreadable, carved from the same stillness he wore in combat zones and strategy briefings. But there was no cruelty in his reply, only clarity. "That's between you and him," he said. "But I suggest you start by listening this time." The words lingered in the air, not shouted but planted, like a marker on a battlefield. A few minutes later, as the auditorium emptied and the custodians began folding chairs, Jaren joined his father outside beneath the brisk wind curling down the concrete steps. Their pace was steady, measured. As they approached the car, the general finally spoke. "Mr. Benson asked if he could apologize to you." Jaren raised an eyebrow. "Did he?" "He said the words," the general replied. "But words are easy." They reached the vehicle. The general opened the passenger door for his son, pausing a moment longer before climbing into the driver's seat. As they settled in, Jaren glanced sideways. "Do you think he meant it?" His father didn't look back immediately. He stared ahead, eyes on the long stretch of campus road lined with sycamore trees turning gold in the autumn air. Then, finally, with a voice calm but weighted, he said, "Doesn't matter what he meant. What matters is what he does next." Actions always outrank apologies. Mr. Benson didn't open the textbook. Instead, as the classroom door clicked shut and the morning hum of footsteps faded in the hallway, he stood behind his desk with his hands resting on either side, fingers lightly drumming the wood as if testing its firmness. A strange pause lingered. Then he looked up, his expression quieter than usual, not stern or commanding, just still. "Before we start," he said, his voice pitched lower than the usual sharp cadence they were used to, "I need to correct something." The class froze. Not in the joking, barely contained fidgeting way most middle schoolers did, but with the kind of alertness that comes when something important, something real, is about to be said. Jaron sat motionless in the third row, arms folded, back straight. He didn't blink. His breath caught in his throat. Not because he expected an apology, but because some part of him was afraid one might come. And with it, the weight of everything he'd been holding back. Mr. Benson's eyes scanned the room briefly before landing on Jaron. 2 weeks ago, he continued, I had doubted a student's truth because it didn't fit my expectations. Not a whisper stirred in the room. I made assumptions, Mr. Benson went on, the words slightly slower now, as if each one required effort. Assumptions based on nothing but my own disbelief. That was wrong. There it was. The words. Clean, unadorned, real. Not even the class clown in the back dared move. Jaron felt every pair of eyes suddenly shift, not toward the teacher, but toward him. The boy who had sat with that weight. The boy who had been right. Mr. Benson stepped from behind the desk and stood in the open aisle. Jaron, he said, now speaking directly to him, I'm sorry. Not just for the words I used, but for the weight I added to your honesty. You didn't deserve that. Jaron didn't reply right away. He looked up, held the teacher's gaze, then slowly nodded. It wasn't dismissive. It wasn't triumphant. It was controlled, like a soldier choosing when to lower his guard. That silence that followed wasn't awkward. It was earned. Mr. Benson exhaled slowly, as if letting go of a tension even he hadn't realized he'd been holding. Then, without another word, he picked up the textbook and flipped it open to the day's lesson. All right, he said, his tone a bit steadier now. Let's talk about the causes of the Western Reformation, but the words felt thinner. Not because they lacked importance, but because everyone in that room had just witnessed a moment more valuable than a history lesson. The rest of the period moved on in fragments. Students followed along, but attention wandered back to Jaron often, not with ridicule this time, but with something closer to respect. Maybe curiosity, maybe even admiration. When the bell finally rang, chairs scraped, books zipped into backpacks, and the normal clatter of movement resumed. But the air had changed. Jaron packed his things slowly, expecting to leave without fanfare. But as he reached the door, Mr. Benson called out, Jaron? A word. He turned, already expecting something about a homework correction or a misplaced paper. Mr. Benson approached, his tone cautious, almost humble. I've been thinking about the Veterans Day assembly next month, he said, voice dropping so others wouldn't overhear. I'd like you to co-lead it, if you're willing. Yadam blinked. Why me? Mr. Benson offered a small, sincere smile, one that lacked his usual performative sharpness. Because you already taught us what it means to stand for something. He paused. The hallway outside was still echoing with noise, but this space between them felt undisturbed. And this time, Mr. Benson said quietly, I'm letting the truth speak first. Jaron Tolliver didn't notice the hallway quieting behind him. He was too focused on the glass case mounted outside the front office, where someone had taped up a fresh copy of the Belcroft Bulletin. The front page bore his name. Big, bold, and impossible to ignore. Middle school student stands his ground. 4-star father stands beside him. He froze. For a second, the world tilted slightly, like he wasn't standing in a middle school, but on a stage he hadn't asked to climb. Footsteps paused behind him. A boy's voice muttered, That's him. Another one whispered, No way, that's really his dad? Jaron stepped back. His reflection hovered over the headline. Come. But something new shimmered just behind his eyes, recognition, not just from others but of himself. The article detailed what had happened in room 12A 2 weeks ago, Mr. Benson's dismissal, the moment General Tolliver walked in, the speech that turned silence into applause. But it didn't glorify anyone. Instead, it focused on one student who stood calmly while truth was questioned, and who didn't lash out, didn't yell, didn't even correct the insults. The quote that hit hardest was from Mr. Benson himself. "I taught history," he said, "but Jaron taught me how to correct it." By lunchtime, the article was all anyone talked about. Jaron sat at the edge of his usual table, tray untouched, watching a group of 8th graders read aloud from someone's printed copy. He didn't even flinch, one boy said. "Man, if that was me, I'd have snapped back hard." Jaron didn't speak. He didn't need to. His silence felt heavier than their words. As days passed, small changes rippled through the school like silent acknowledgments. Students nodded to him in the hallways. Boys who used to ignore him now offered quiet respect. Some asked genuine questions. What's it like having a dad who served in a war zone? How'd you stay so calm when Mr. Benson said that stuff? Did you know he was going to walk in like that? Each time, Jaron answered the same way, honestly, but never dramatically. He said he'd show up, so I believed him. Or, you don't always need to fight to win. His answers were never rehearsed, just real, and somehow, that made them stronger. One afternoon, as he and his father unpacked groceries from the trunk of their car, General Tolliver handed Jaron a bag of oranges, then paused. "You carry your name differently now," he said, not as a compliment but an observation. Jaron looked up, a bag in each hand. "I guess it carries me," he replied, his voice soft but sure. His father said nothing else, but the faint, proud glint in his eyes said more than words. Later that evening, Jaron opened the printed bulletin again and reread the article. The paragraph about his restraint stood out the most, not because it praised him, but because it understood him. He thought about Mr. Benson, about how the man hadn't spoken much in class since that day. There were no more smirks, no more side comments, just quiet, a kind of careful respect that felt unfamiliar but welcome. Then came the letter, delivered in a manila envelope, bearing the district seal. Jaron wasn't supposed to open it, but his father did, right at the kitchen counter. He read it twice before sliding it over. "The school board," General Tolliver said, tapping the page, "has formally invited me to speak at next month's Regional Leadership Summit." Yada blinked. "They want you to speak about leadership, about integrity." Apparently, some of the board members read the article. He paused. "But I'm not sure they realized this all started with a classroom and a boy who didn't raise his voice." Jaron looked at the envelope, then back at his father. "Are you going to do it?" General Tolliver nodded. "Yes, but I already asked to change the theme." "To what?" "Truth," he said simply, "and how it doesn't need to raise its voice." Jaron leaned back in his chair, letting the moment settle. He didn't know what the future held for his school, his teacher, or even the students who used to mock him. But he knew this much. Something had shifted, not just around him, but inside him. He thought again about that headline, about how people now looked at him differently, not because his father was a general, but because he had stood his ground without a single outburst. A knock at the door pulled him from his thoughts. His neighbor, Mr. Kell, stood with an extra copy of the bulletin in hand. "Keep it," the man said, smiling. "That's one for the scrapbooks." Jaron took it, folded it carefully, and placed it inside his school binder next to the original project sheet Mr. Benson had once dismissed. He looked at the paper one more time before slipping it away and saying, mostly to himself, "All I did was tell the truth." Jaron's fingers gripped the edge of the wooden podium as he stepped forward, the murmur of the packed auditorium falling into a heavy, expectant silence. His navy blazer, crisply ironed, caught the overhead light in muted glints, and the small eagle-shaped pin on his lapel, his father's, glinted with quiet symbolism. He didn't scan the crowd, didn't fidget or clear his throat. Instead, he leaned into the microphone, his voice steady, but low enough that it forced the room to lean in. 2 months ago, he began, I said something that didn't sound believable. A ripple passed through the crowd. Teachers, classmates, parents, veterans seated in rows, some in full uniform, others in worn jackets and medals that whispered their own stories. General Tolliver sat in the front row, his posture erect, his eyes locked on his son, not in command, but in support. Not because it was exaggerated, Jaron continued, his gaze fixed somewhere just above the crowd, but because sometimes people can't recognize strength when it's quiet. He let that line hang. His voice had not risen, but the weight behind the words had. Mr. Benson sat near the back, lips drawn tight, hands folded in his lap like they were holding something brittle. The spotlight didn't reach him, but guilt didn't need light to be seen. Jaron's fingers flexed slightly against the wood. He had rehearsed this, not to perform, but to make sure he didn't falter. To make sure his voice carried truth, not noise. Strength, he said, isn't always in how loud you speak. It's in patience, in truth, and in the people who show up when they say they will. Some of the 8th graders in the front row shifted uncomfortably. They knew the story. Most of them had seen it unfold. Others had heard it whispered between lockers, in cafeteria lines, at bus stops. Jaren Tolliver, the kid whose father walked into a classroom and made silence more powerful than shouting. Jaren pushed. Then he turned, slow, deliberate, and gestured toward the front row. All eyes followed his hand. General Langston Tolliver stood. The sound of his boots, rising from the floor, was louder than expected in the hush. He climbed the 3 steps to the stage with the precision of a man trained to measure each movement. He took his place beside his son, but did not overshadow him. His eyes scanned the crowd once, then settled on no one in particular. He stepped forward just slightly. Service, the general said, doesn't always wear camouflage. There was no microphone in his hand. He didn't need one. His voice had presence, not through volume, but through the quiet authority of a man who'd stood in briefing rooms and war zones, now speaking to a middle school crowd with the same measured respect. Sometimes, he said, it wears a student ID, speaks softly, and stands taller than expected. A breath caught in the throat of the room. Not a gasp, just the soft inhale of people who had never heard such a sentence spoken on a school stage. The applause didn't begin all at once. It started with a few claps in the veterans section, then a burst from the back. Then students stood, then parents, then the entire auditorium. Jaron remained still, his eyes on his father, heart pounding, not from nerves, but from something deeper. Something that had begun 2 months ago in a history classroom and now unfolded beneath auditorium lights with a weight of vindication. He turned toward his father, and the general gave him the slightest nod, not approval, not praise, but acknowledgement. Mutual understanding, the kind that could only be forged in the furnace of doubt, truth, and the decision to stand when silence would have been easier. They stood side by side, student and general, father and son. Jaron no longer the boy in the 3rd row, hoping someone would believe him. Now, he stood not in his father's shadow, but in his light. And this time, no one dared doubt it. Mr. Benson's voice echoed through the auditorium, steady but subdued. For the student who taught us that truth doesn't need a stage, it just needs to stand. He turned, plaque in hand, and looked toward the front row. Jaron Tolliver rose slowly, each step down the aisle deliberate, grounded not in pride, but in a calm that had taken weeks to earn. He approached the podium without glancing at the crowd. Applause broke around him, not thunderous, not hollow, but real. General Tolliver, seated near the exit, didn't stand or wave. He simply watched. The Tolliver Honor of Truth Award had been born only days earlier, in a quietly unanimous vote by the staff. No flyers had been printed, no announcements made. It had spread like something sacred, passed from conversation to conversation until it was fact. Jaron hadn't known until this morning. When the principal handed him a sealed envelope in homeroom, his first instinct was confusion. Then came the nod, the same nod his father gave when something mattered. Now, with the plaque warm in his hands, Jaron walked back to his seat. The bell for winter break rang, just as the last names were called. Students scattered toward the doors, their chatter blending with the rustle of coats and backpacks. Jaron moved slower. He stopped only when he stepped outside and saw the matte gray military vehicle parked under the bare oak tree near the curb. His father leaned against it, arms crossed, coat draped neatly over one shoulder. "You ready?" General Tolliver asked, his tone casual, but his eyes searching. Jaron didn't hesitate. More than ready. As the vehicle pulled out of the school parking lot, silence settled in the cabin. It wasn't heavy or strained, just full. Jaron looked out the window as familiar buildings slid past, kids on bikes darted through crosswalks, and the distant sound of bells marked the season. Then they passed the school's main sign. The maroon letters beneath the Belcroft Middle School name had been changed. When the truth is quiet, it speaks loudest in the moment of doubt. Yaron blinked, sat straighter. "That one's going in the yearbook, isn't it?" he asked, eyes still on the fading sign. General Tolliver smiled without turning. "It's already in the history books." Minutes later, the general's entrance froze the room. The teacher's arrogance evaporated, and the boy's truth was fully vindicated. Authority and respect had won without a single misstep. If you believe real power protects the innocent with precision, clarity, and unstoppable force, subscribe now, because justice always lands first. Disclaimer: the story you just watched is fictional. It highlights prejudice, assumptions, and the consequences of underestimating someone based on race. Its purpose is to raise awareness, inspire empathy, and encourage reflection on respect, integrity, and accountability.